HOA president refused to reimburse my $28,500 repair, so I locked every family out of the lake. She could not live without the letter was 2 paragraphs long. It cited the wrong clause, ignored the section that actually governed the situation, and arrived 11 days after I submitted documentation proving the HOA was legally responsible for a repair I had already paid for out of my own savings. I folded it, put it in my pocket, stood up from that table, and walked out without saying a single word. By noon the following day, every path to Cedar Lake was locked, legal and permanent. My name is Garrett. I am 51 years old, and I spent 22 years doing electrical contracting before I got disciplined enough about money to buy something that actually mattered. I purchased my home at Kettle Cove in 2018 because I wanted my daughter to grow up with a lake the way she had spent every summer at camp, surrounded by water and quiet, and the particular freedom that comes from both. Kettle Cove is a small community of 24 homes tucked behind a tree line of old-growth oaks about 40 miles outside Nashville. Every property backs up against Cedar Lake, 11 acres of cold green water that smells like pine resin and wet clay after summer rain. It is genuinely beautiful, and it was genuinely worth fighting for. The HOA president, when I moved in, was a woman named Renata. She had held the position for 6 years, and she treated the role the way some people treat a personal inheritance, as something that existed to serve her specifically. She had fined 17 separate homeowners for unapproved aesthetic modifications in 6 years, a category she appeared to be inventing as she went. One neighbor, a retired firefighter named Cobb, received a written warning because his garden hose was the wrong shade of green. That citation is real. It is in the official meeting minutes. He had it framed on his garage wall. Renata's brother-in-law Dale owned the only landscaping company the HOA would contract. Every time work came up, Dale's company received it at rates that made every other contractor in the county squint and look at the ceiling. The dues kept climbing, and the quality of maintenance kept declining, and Renata kept smiling, the particular smile of someone who believes the rules exist to protect her specifically. In the fall of 2021, a storm washed out the shared drainage culvert on the east side of the lake. This culvert controls the water table for the lower properties. Without it functioning properly, 3 homes flood in a heavy rain, mine included. The HOA's own governing documents listed shared drainage infrastructure as a board-maintained common element in black and white. Renata called an emergency board meeting, voted with her 2 hand-picked co-members to defer maintenance pending a full infrastructure audit, and never commissioned the audit. The culvert sat partially collapsed for 6 months while I sent certified letters that came back as form responses. In April of 2022, I hired a licensed civil contractor named Tuck, who had 30 years of experience and 0 patience for bureaucratic delay. He repaired the culvert properly, reinforced concrete pipe, proper outflow protection, correct grading throughout, $28,500. Every cent from savings I had spent 22 years building. I submitted the reimbursement request with full documentation. The denial arrived 11 days later. It cited Section 7, Paragraph 2 of the operating agreement, which governs discretionary improvements and cosmetic upgrades. It said nothing about emergency infrastructure repair or drainage or common elements. They had cited the closest available denial language and hoped I would not read carefully enough to notice the difference. I noticed. I went to see my attorney Phyllis, who has practiced HOA and property law in Middle Tennessee for 27 years. She reviewed the documents for 8 minutes and told me I was looking at the necessary expenditure doctrine. When a property owner repairs shared infrastructure that a responsible party failed to maintain, courts have repeatedly found recovery is available even without prior authorization. Phyllis drafted a demand letter citing the correct clause, referencing the doctrine by name, and attaching my contractor invoices alongside a timeline showing 6 months of ignored certified correspondence. Renata's response was not to consult her own attorney. She called a neighborhood meeting instead and told 11 neighbors in folding chairs that I had taken unauthorized action on community property and was attempting to extract money through legal intimidation. I let her finish her presentation. Then I raised my hand and asked one question. I asked her to point me to the section of the operating agreement that designated the drainage culvert as owner-maintained rather than board-maintained. She looked at her agenda. She looked at the ceiling. She adjourned the meeting. 3 weeks later, she sent a special assessment notice to every homeowner, $1,200 per household, 23 households, $28,800 total, due within 60 days. The math was identical to my reimbursement request, within $300. She was attempting to have the community pay the board back for a cost she had just refused to reimburse me for. Cobb nearly spit out his sweet tea when he read the notice. Tennessee law requires homeowner approval by vote for special assessments above a certain threshold. Renata had approved this internally with her 3-person board only. No homeowner vote, no required notice, period, nothing. I filed a formal objection within 48 hours, and 7 neighbors joined it within the week. While the objection was processing, I spent 45 minutes and $8 in copying fees at the county recorder's office, pulling the original development plat. What I found changed everything. The legal access path to Cedar Lake ran through a strip of land covered by an easement granted in 1987 to the original development company. That company had dissolved in 1994. There was no recorded transfer of the easement to the HOA, not in 1994, not ever. I brought this to Phyllis. She made a sound that was different from her usual professional satisfaction, quieter, more deliberate, the sound of someone who has just watched a legal structure become significantly more interesting. An easement does not automatically survive corporate dissolution. The HOA had been acting as though it controlled lake access for 30 years on a foundation that had quietly ceased to exist. We found the owner of the underlying land through county tax records and a probate filing. Her name was Pet, a retired school principal in Chattanooga who had been paying small annual taxes on a strip of property. She had never fully understood she owned. Phyllis called her and explained the situation. Pet listened to everything and then said she was glad to have the access agreement properly recorded, that this was by far the most interesting property she had ever owned, and asked how much it was worth. The answer was considerable. If you own the only legal access path to an 11-acre private lake with 24 properties depending on it, and the easement that previously covered that access has lapsed, you own something that controls everything. We negotiated a formal recorded access agreement, not with Renata's board, but with a newly formed homeowner association, one with democratic bylaws, mandatory financial disclosure, and an explicit prohibition on self-dealing contracts. While the new association was being structured, I installed a steel security gate at the bridge crossing Pet's land. I did it myself on a Tuesday morning with her written, notarized authorization. Every household that joined the new association received a key. Everyone else's access depended on an HOA whose legal authority to deliver that access no longer existed. Renata retained an attorney who argued prescriptive easement by continuous use. Phyllis replied in 4 paragraphs, noting that prescriptive easements require adverse use without permission. The original 1987 easement meant the use had always been permitted. You cannot claim prescription on land you had an express right to use. The permission breaks the prescription entirely. Meanwhile, Phyllis had obtained the HOA's financial records through Tennessee's homeowner inspection statute. Dale Pinfield's landscaping company had been paid $67,000 over 3 years by an association with a stated annual operating budget of $31,000. Dale's company had collected more than 2 years of the association's entire budget in 3 years of contracts for a community of 24 homes. Renata tried filing a codes complaint about my gate. The inspector came out, found the gate properly permitted as an agricultural gate on private property, and while looking around, noted that 2 sections of the HOA's shared dock appeared to be below the load-bearing standards required by county code. He wrote it up. That report went automatically to the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, which was already reviewing our financial complaint. Renata had called in an inspector to investigate my gate, and the inspector had written up her dock. The board co-members quietly retained their own attorneys and resigned within days of each other. Renata was left as the sole officer of an HOA with no functioning board, a state investigation underway, a gate she could not touch, and 20 of 24 homeowners in a new association with actual recorded legal access to the lake. At the annual October community meeting, 22 of 24 homeowners showed up more than any meeting in the previous 6 years. Phyllis sat in the back. A representative from the Tennessee Real Estate Commission sat near the door as an observer. Renata had her printed agenda and her careful expression, but she was alone at the table for the first time in 6 years. I laid out the full sequence in order: the drainage failure, the ignored requests, the repair, the denial citing the wrong clause, the improper special assessment, the lapsed easement, the gate, and the new association. The motion to dissolve the board and commission an independent audit passed 21-1 before I finished reading it aloud. Renata gathered her agenda, walked out of the clubhouse, and drove away. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Cobb said he was going to go get his garden hose. The room laughed, and it was the best sound any of us had heard in 2 years. The independent audit confirmed $67,000 in discrepancies across 3 years of Dale's contracts. The Tennessee Real Estate Commission issued formal findings against Renata for breach of fiduciary duty and barred her from serving as an HOA officer in the state for 5 years. The new board approved my reimbursement of $28,500 unanimously at their first meeting. It passed in approximately 4 minutes, which is exactly how long that decision should have taken from the beginning. The most dangerous person in any HOA meeting is simply the one who actually read the documents. Renata had gone 6 years without anyone doing that. That is what made her careless. That is what made her sign the wrong clause on a denial letter. That is what made her call a building inspector to hurt a neighbor and accidentally get her own dock written up. Unchecked authority does not stay careful. It gets lazy. And lazy authority leaves a paper trail that a patient person with a folder and 45 minutes at a county recorder's office can follow all the way to the end.